The previous video in this series, Part 12, ended with the men of the 5th Kentucky Infantry refusing to leave the state again as their one-year enlistment had ended. This video examines the conditions that awaited them in the aftermath of their dismissal and the events that led to the end of the war. Within a few days after, quote, a magnificent regiment vanished, unquote, a new recruiting effort was begun to re-enlist some of the men and enlisted the help of its original commander, Jack May. For the most part, the effort to retain the veterans of the old unit was unsuccessful, but did manage to bring together enough new recruits, about 300, to put together a new, albeit smaller, regiment. The recent events signified the high water mark of Confederate control in eastern Kentucky. Bragg and Smith withdrew their armies to Tennessee to guard against an invasion of the Deep South. John Hunt Morgan's raiders would continue to blow up ammunition dumps and disrupt rail lines, and there would be an occasional incursion into the state for recruiting and provisions, and even a few more battles. But the Confederates would never seriously threaten Kentucky for the rest of the war. It became a progressively less hospitable place for such incursions. They were increasingly plagued by home guard bushwhackers who picked off rebels one at a time as they marched through the countryside. Any bushwhackers caught would be summarily shot and their homes burned. As the war dragged on, the locals simply wanted the killing and looting to stop. Civil War historians often give short shrift to the war in Kentucky, but the failure of one of the largest Confederate armies of the war to bring the state into the fold of the Confederacy was, in hindsight, a turning point long before Gettysburg and Vicksburg. A Confederate general would later write, quote, "With the failure to hold Kentucky, our best and last chance to win the war was thrown away. All of the subsequent tremendous struggle was but a dying agony of a great cause and a gallant people," unquote. We know the overall rest of the story of the Civil War. Things began to go badly for the Confederacy, with the incomprehensible losses by Lee's army on July 1st through the 3rd, 1863, as well as staggering Union losses at Gettysburg and the fall of Vicksburg, Mississippi the following day, Independence Day, after a weeks-long siege by Ulysses S. Grant's Army of Tennessee. The Union victory at Chattanooga in November 1863 opened up the heart of the Confederacy to Union advancement. While Lee bobbed, weaved, and dodged total defeat in the North after the debacle at Gettysburg, William T. Sherman overran Atlanta in September 1864 and began his march to the sea, sweeping up or destroying everything in his path useful to the Confederate war effort that culminated in his providing Lincoln with a Christmas, quote, gift, unquote, on December 21st with the fall of Savannah. In quick succession, in early 1865, the U.S. Congress ratified the 13th Amendment, officially banning slavery. Columbia, South Carolina was destroyed by fire, Lincoln was inaugurated for a second term, Petersburg fell, and the Confederate government evacuated Richmond. And on April 9, Lee was finally forced to accept terms of surrender at Appomattox. The war was over, at least officially. As for the men of the 5th Kentucky who returned home in 1862, life was nothing like it had been when they left a year earlier, and often more dangerous for them than facing the Union Army. Where federal forces were in control in the summer of 1863, draft notices were issued for all men of fighting age, regardless of whether they had been in the Confederate Army, and some were forced to switch sides at the point of a pistol. What we don't know are the details of the personal homecomings of our ancestors, whether they were welcomed as heroes, harassed by pro-Union home guards, or perhaps both. There is a detailed account by ex-5th Kentucky member George Washington Noble about his homecoming to Breathitt County, adjacent to Morgan County where the Barkers and Gevedons lived, written in 1912. In it, he describes having to, quote, lay out, unquote, in the woods on many occasions to avoid being arrested by Union forces or killed by bands of Unionist bushwhackers. All around him there were roaming bands of men seeking payback killings for payback killings, seemingly ad infinitum. Many ex-5th Kentucky members were killed, run off, or arrested. Anyone caught recruiting men for the Southern cause was arrested by the Union Army or Unionist militias and shot. Many signed the oath of allegiance to the United States or switched sides, but that did not protect them from retaliation from separatists or by Unionists for past allegiances. To say there was general lawlessness would be an understatement. Many ex-soldiers and deserters rejoined the Confederate Army because they actually felt safer around like-minded men with guns. Even then, retaliation against their relatives was not uncommon. Incredibly, bloodier feuds than the Hatfields and the McCoys in Pike County, Kentucky, continued for nearly a half century in Breathitt County after the war. There is no reason to believe that Morgan County was much different. Perhaps in retaliation or for self-protection, a few of the younger veterans of the 5th Kentucky formed their own home guards and marauded through eastern Kentucky throughout the rest of the war, looting and even killing people. After the war, many of these men banded together as, quote, regulators, unquote, to intimidate voters in Morgan and Wolfe counties. There is no evidence that any of the Barkers or Gevedons were involved with home guards or the regulators. For one thing, Henry Barker and his brother John had families to return to and farms to run, and their brother George did join the reorganized 5th. No doubt the Barker and Gevedon ex-soldiers saw or were at least aware of their former comrades as they passed through Grassy Creek, Hazel Green, West Liberty, and Campton on return incursions. Whether they offered provisions and or shelter to them or were afraid or disinclined to do so, we will probably never know. The fate of specific individuals will be discussed in the next video, Part 14.